Good evening, everyone. My name is Bruce Campbell. I am the director of the Latino Latin American Studies program at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. I'd like to welcome you to the first event of our fall series, the Fall Latino Latin American Studies series. This semester explores issues under the theme of race, gender, and power in Latin America. Latin America's racial and gender systems are different, both historically and in the present, from those of the United States. For example, the territories that are now called the United States were colonized through the physical displacement and isolation of native peoples, while what is now called Latin America was colonized by subjugating native peoples as a cheap labor source for the colonial economy. Where the United States is characterized by a history of white supremacism expressed and embodied through a binary racial system, white versus non-white, Latin America's history of racism is marked by the complication of mestizaje, which is the Spanish term for racial and cultural mixing, and by a complex hierarchy of racial dominance reflected in the colonial era casta system and the inheritance of that era in the present. Latin America's gender binary, male versus female, feminine versus masculine, is different from that of the United States as well, due in part to the cultural power of Catholicism, which among other things has shaped an ideal of femininity in the image of the Virgin Mary. This semester's event series will highlight some of the different ways and different contexts in Latin America in which gender and racial identity are negotiated, and often intersectionally. This semester, I would like to invite students who are interested in exploring these issues to register in our 0 or 1 credit course, LLAS 270. This is an informal learning community that attends the series events, and if participants are interested, often then produces some cultural artifact for the broader community. In the past, this has been mural production, for example. We've done poetry installations. This semester, to be honest with you, I'm kind of hoping that we will design and produce a Latino Latin American Studies t-shirt. So if you're interested in being involved with that, or if you have questions about the Latino Latin American Studies minor, I've put my contact information in the chat for you to email me after the event. I will now turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Megan Sheehan, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. It's my great pleasure to get to introduce Dr. Sandra Aguilar-Rodríguez. Dr. Aguilar-Rodríguez joins us today from Pennsylvania, where she is the associate professor and serves as the chair of the history department at Moravian College. Dr. Aguilar-Rodríguez completed her graduate studies in the UK, where she earned her master's from the University of Oxford and her PhD from the University of Manchester. She completed a postdoc fellowship at Lehigh University before joining the faculty at Moravian College, where she teaches on colonial and modern Latin American and Mexican history. Dr. Aguilar-Rodríguez's research takes a critical approach to the role that food, modernization processes, and nutrition programs played in the lives of Mexicans during the 20th century. Her articles and chapters trace engagements with specific foods from milk and wheat to mole and chocolate as a way of examining societal and cultural changes, including analyses of race and national identity, gender roles and the ways they are impacted by socioeconomic class, modernization, and the development of national nutritional programs. In work that bears consideration for the ways that our current food practices are shaped by disparities along gendered, racial, and class lines, Dr. Aguilar-Rodríguez's writing examines the ways that these critical social distinctions framed everyday food practices and mediated how nutritional programs and campaigns were received in the early 20th century. Dr. Aguilar-Rodríguez is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Cooking Modernity, Food, Gender, and Class in the Mid-20th Century Mexico. And this work situates women, the kitchen, and food at the forefront of the modernization process by examining women's agency at home and the failure of nutrition programs in Mexico. Today's talk will share part of her work with us and is entitled Nutrition, Race, and Gender in Mexico. On one quick practical note before we get going, after the talk, we'll have plenty of time for questions. To submit a question at any time during the talk, please use the question function on the webinar, and we will be sure to address these questions at the end. So now I want to say thank you, and on behalf of the CSBSW community, I want to welcome Dr. Sandra Aguilar-Rodríguez.
Well, thank you very much. I, of course, first want to thank Dr. Mehan Jihen, Dr. Bruce Campbell, and of course the whole community of the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. So thank you for this invitation. Thank you for being here, for joining us on this evening. In which, well, we are continuing the celebration of the Mexican independence that took place yesterday. And well, I am originally from Mexico, so there you can have the connection. So let me kind of like start sharing my screen, and I will try to sort of like present the material in the next sort of like 35 minutes, so that in a way, we can have also more time to talk about what is of your interest, what are some of the things that you are finding revealing, puzzling, surprising, interesting, and any sort of like questions that you may have. So this presentation, I entitled it Nutrition, Race, and Gender. Now I added the 1930s so that you can have that time period in mind. And we start with this advertisement that comes from the 1950s. It has color, like in the 1930s, still in Mexico, most of the ads were published in black and white. But I definitely think that this is an interesting sort of like way to enter. Well, they are selling a stove, and they are in a way, what the narrative there in the ad says is like that you need to be careful in selecting your future husband, because if you make the right choice, you will be marrying somebody who has enough money to buy you a gas stove. If that's not the case, you will be cooking with charcoal or with paraffin or something else, and then your life is going to be miserable. But in addition to that I find very interesting, of course, is like the image that comes like clearly from like an American publicity agency. So you have like this blonde girl, so nothing like similar to what most of Mexicans look like. And of course, we have Mexicans who have blonde hair and blue eyes, but that's not the majority of the population. And it's really interesting how like they decide to use this image to basically sell a gas stove. So let's kind of like go through some of the basic information in terms of the context that I want to give you, because I think it's important for you to have a sense of like the idea of race, the idea of gender, and what is going on at this moment in time in Mexico, particularly in this slide. I want to sort of like address the idea of eugenics and what it is and how it impacted Mexico in the early 20th century. So in order to do that, I'm going to talk first about Porfirio Diaz. So Porfirio Diaz rose to power in 1876 and remained in office until the Mexican Revolution erupted in 1910, basically to kick him out of office. And well, his government was heavily influenced by positivist ideas that were basically claiming that scientific knowledge was the solution to all human problems. Order and progress was his motto, and everybody in his mind had to be in its right place in order to move forward. In terms of race, Porfirian intellectuals and politicians followed the path of thinkers such as Herbert Spencer, who was a British intellectual, who was inspired by Charles Darwin's theory of biological evolution and presented human history basically as the outcome of the survival of the fittest. In Spencer's mind, Caucasians were clearly superior as they were able to conquer the world and develop a material civilization unlike any other. Moreover, the Anglo-Saxons represented the pinnacle of that evolution. Spencer's theory had a long-lasting impression in Francisco Bulnes, who was a senator and an intellectual during the time of Porfirio Diaz. He claimed that indigenous people were an inferior race destined to disappear. The Spaniards tried to civilize them, but their efforts were in vain. Furthermore, indigenous poverty caused by their own nature as lazy, evil, and intellectually inferior, which was what Bulnes argued. In his mind, maize or corn was at the base of indigenous people's backwardness, and that progress will follow from the substitution of maize with basically wheat. So here we start to see this discussion about how to transform the race, how to improve the race, and if there is any hope. And in his mind, well, one of the main problems, of course, was the fact that most Mexicans have corn as the main foodstuff in their diets, and that was seen as not nutritious enough, as a grain that was not able to produce the civilization that you can encounter in Europe in his mind. So discussions about race and evolution gave rise to eugenics, a field created by Sir Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin. And he was interested in improving human beings by studying the hereditary transmission of phenotypes and family history. So eugenicists divided the population into distinct and unequal races, asserting differences and creating boundaries. The main point of discussion was if those differences were fixed and natural, so basically biological, or if characteristics could be modified, and if so, how to do it. While in the Porfiriato, the biological perspective dominated, after the revolution, which took place between 1910 and 1920, most eugenicists considered that social improvement was possible, and it was achieved through education and sanitation rather than genetic inheritance and race strictly. Thus, the so-called backward populations were able to uplift themselves through learning the right way of living. This approach goes along with Lamarckian notions, which proposed the inheritance of acquired characters. In other words, that external influences can alter an individual life, and that those changes were going to pass on to future generations. In opposition, Mendelian conceptions of genetics dominant in the United States, Great Britain, and Germany highlighted that successful individuals and groups were genetically and innately well endowed, and thus the poor and unsuccessful were viewed as products of poor heredity. For them, ancestry rather than social life determined different groups and their success or their failure. So these are basically the two main schools of thought that influenced thinkers in Latin America, and in this case, in particularly in Mexico. So these Mexican intellectuals who went from a Mendelian understanding in, for example, Bulnes, when talking about the Indian problem, to a Lamarckian perspective, so moved later to a Lamarckian perspective in discussing what now was called the social question. The poor were not poor because they were lazy or inferior, but as a result of living in unhygienic conditions and ignorance, aspects that could be modified. And here we're going to talk about these two very important figures, Manuel Molina Enriquez and Jose Vasconcelos, and the whole idea of mestizaje that Dr. Campbell introduced, basically the mixing of two different races. In the case of Mexico, it was understood as the mix of Spanish blood with indigenous blood, more frequently in the early colonial period, an indigenous women and a Spanish men. So according to Andrés Molina Enriquez, who wrote The Great National Problems in 1909, the history of Mexico was basically the rise of the mestizos. So for him, the way to understanding the past and understanding how Mexican history progressed was like the birth of this new race, of this mix of the mestizos. And for him, land ownership, which is something that I highlight here, was a key factor to transform Mexico from a subsistence economy to capitalism. And that has been seen as one of the core elements to transform the countryside in particular, like having access to private property and having access to land to basically do this jump from just self-subsistency, like growing your own food and that's it, to basically selling and producing more for a market. And in his mind, that was basically the way to improve the living conditions and the diet of the Mexicans. So basically having more money for them to buy things that they could not produce. Jose Vasconcelos was the Minister of Education between 1921 and 1924. And he solidified the mestizaje narrative through his book, The Cosmic Race, which was published in 1925. But more importantly, by incorporating this discourse into education. So of course, the book was influential, but how many people read the book? So not as many. The most important effect or influence that he had was through his own policies as Minister of Education. During his time in office, he created the Cultural Missions, an education program aimed at decreasing the illiteracy rate of 80%. On top of teaching how to read and write, these missions had the goal of instilling Western values and culture among the peasantry and indigenous peoples. Vasconcelos' program went from teaching Spanish to reading Greek classics, as well as inculcating middle-class moral values and in daily practices. Rafael Ramirez, who was director of rural education under Vasconcelos, demanded, and here is a quote, that children not only learn the Spanish language, but also acquire our customs and lifestyles, which are unquestionably superior to theirs. They must know that Indians call us gente de razón, or people of reason, not only because we speak Spanish, but because we dress and eat differently. And I find this quote very, very interesting and revealing, because on the one hand is that emphasizing, well, Indians have to learn Spanish. They have to be able to communicate in our language, but also that in order to be seen as equals, they have to basically dress and eat in the same way that the middle class rural dwellers like used to. And basically that was inspired or influenced to a great extent by Western cultural values and what nowadays we call the global North. So Ramirez reveals that Porfirian understandings of race were not completely gone in the post-revolutionary era, since for him, Indians had hope as long as they assimilated, and thus left their culture behind. Now I'm going to focus on a couple of books, and I, as somebody who studies daily life, gender, food ways, one of the main sources that I have are basically cookbooks, but also the sort of like books that provide advice, that talk about child rearing, talk about like sort of like medical information, but for the general public, and nutrition information for the general public, to try to understand how doctors and professionals and policymakers and intellectuals and those who were kind of like working in the government were trying to sort of like disseminate these ideas among this majority who, again, if you think about 1920, like 80% or so were illiterate. So it's definitely a big challenge. So let me talk about this book first, and I'm going to kind of like show you some images, which is another thing that I find very interesting and that I rely upon as a historian of daily life and of culture a lot. So it's very important for me to look at these images. So this is kind of like the image coming from this book that was called Libro para la Madre Mexicana, or Book for the Mexican Mother. Again, the sort of like image that we see here of this young mother with a baby is not necessarily an image of how most Mexicans, and particularly Mexicans from the peasantry and working class, look like. This is definitely a woman that has like very sort of like European features. Like, again, it's black and white, so you cannot necessarily guarantee for sure the color of her skin, the color of her hair, but like her facial features are definitely much more European than mestizos, or let alone close to being indigenous or native. So it definitely gives you the sense of like where these, where the authors were heading to, and the sort of like image that they want to give. So this book in particular was published in 1933, and there are a series of doctors that are presented as the authors of this book. Mainly the main doctor that is at the sort of like at the top of the like editorial team that worked in this book is Dr. Manuel Martinez, but also Francisco de Paula Miranda, Mario Torroella, and Manuel Cárdenas de la Vega. And most of them are young doctors. Manuel Martinez is more of the senior figure, but they all have like very important positions within the like public welfare, public health system in Mexico. And this book was was given for free, and it was also sort of like endorsed by the First Lady of Mexico, Aida Rodriguez. So she kind of like appears also in one of the early pages, the only page in color with her three sons, and sort of like basically gives you the sense that she writes the preface to the book, but again, it's not completely clear. She's sort of like endorsing the book, but it's not like as clear if she is actually writing the first pages or if she's just saying, well, I am endorsing this book. And I think that every mother has to learn something from this source. But one of the sort of like quotes that we have at the beginning, one of the statements that we have at the beginning that like we are kind of like not completely sure if it's coming from her or from these doctors, goes like that. And this is again a quote. The selfishness of an active and intelligent woman is able to raise a strong and healthy individual who will contribute to his family and our society. It is sure that a strong and normal child can degenerate into an ill and inferior being due to the ignorance or negligence of mothers. So basically the idea that women, and particularly mothers, were responsible of raising healthy and strong children. And this idea of self-denial, of basically dedicating your life to your family, it's definitely at the core here. And women's education for her and for this group of doctors is extremely important, particularly in regards to early childhood. According to Dr. Martinez, the main causes of deficient child development and disease were mainly poor diet and lack of hygiene, which resulted out of ignorance and poverty. So in his mind, the main issue was that women were not aware of how they had to raise their kids, which were the right things to do, and they relied upon sort of like advice coming from other women who in his mind were just sort of like, or in the mind of these doctors, were just sort of like reproducing misinformations and practices that were not helpful, and in fact they were detrimental. So it's really interesting because in a way it shows you, or it reveals that for these doctors, traditional knowledge that was basically passed from generation to generation, and particularly among women, was not really useful at all. It was not valuable, and in fact, as I said, it caused more problems rather than solve them, particularly in regards to health. And I also think it's important again to highlight that by this moment in time, in the 1930s, still 91% of the population were part of the working class. So, well, this book was a free book, so they didn't have to pay for it. But the other point is that also, like the illiteracy rate had been reduced from 80%, let's say in 1910, to 66%. So it's improving, but again, like 66% of the population couldn't actually read this book. And again, they most likely were within the sectors that they had in mind, the peasants and the workers. So it's also interesting to see how that was not necessarily something that doctors had in mind. Something else that we need to consider is that sometimes these books were also sort of like addressed to teachers, and they were the ones who translated this knowledge and who spread this knowledge in their own communities, particularly if they were like working and teaching in the countryside or in like poor urban neighborhoods. So let me show you these couple of images that I find very, very interesting. So the image that you have on your right basically comes along with this piece of advice. Daily walks contribute to your child's health. So it's the idea that women have to go out every day with their newborns, with their babies, so that they can breathe fresh air, and that is something that will help children to grow healthy. What I find fascinating, again, from this image is that this young lady definitely is wearing the sort of like garments that you will find more in a middle-class household, kind of like the heels, the high heels, sort of like her skirt, like even her short hair. So all those features in a way depict somebody living in a urban neighborhood, and most likely a middle-class urban neighborhood. You also have the stroller and the sort of like car that she's pushing, which of course was beyond the possibilities, the economic possibilities of most of the population. So they could not afford to buy this. So that was something that only the upper class could actually acquire at that moment in time in Mexico. And the other very important element, of course, is the landscape. The idea that you live close to a park, that you will go to a park, or there will be at least sidewalks, that you will sort of like go to a place where there are trees, where there's nature, and that in particularly in urban areas, well, that was not as common, even in the 1930s. Again, there were some parks, but mainly in upper middle class neighborhoods. And in other areas, like there might be like, perhaps there were like sidewalks, but that was it. And in the countryside, well, of course you have nature, but you don't have like parks, you don't have sidewalks, there is dust all over. So this idea that you are going to sort of like take your time to go and stroll in a park is definitely something that I'm sure like most workers and peasants did not see, kind of like how, like did not see the logic of that idea in their own life. Again, you have these women who like apparently doesn't have any other children. And again, at this moment in time, women have like, particularly in the working and class and among the peasantry, like the average number of children was between like 8 children, and easily some of them had more. So again, like if you have more than 2 children, it's highly unlikely that you're going to have the time to sort of like go around and basically spend some leisure time in the park with your baby. On the other side, we have this image that portrays a very different woman, and this is one of the few images within the book that portrays women with clearly indigenous features, and also like the way she's dressed with the shawl, the braids, that also makes allusion to her background and the fact that she most likely is an indigenous woman. So there are very few. So most of the images that you encounter in this book are similar to the one that you have on your right, of this like very elegant, modern mom. And on the other hand, we have this young women with her baby. Most likely, and still nowadays, like most of the indigenous women will carry their babies in a shawl. So they will use this shawl to wrap the baby around them. So again, now you have like these baby carriers and the wraps that are kind of like very fashionable in the US, and also in Mexico, but traditionally this has been seen as one of the features of indigenous women, who like, on the one hand, they have to like carry their baby all the time, and on the other hand, they don't have money to buy a stroller or anything else. And here, what this woman is doing is basically giving an alcoholic beverage that's called pulque, mildly alcoholic, so it's kind of like a fermented drink. She's giving that to her son or her daughter with her fingers. And this is basically described as never give alcoholic beverages to children. So this is very interesting. The case of pulque is fascinating. And again, like here, what I want to highlight is that pulque is a fermented beverage that is extracted out of the agave, different agave to the one that produces tequila, but it's a plant that belongs to the same family. And in many areas in central Mexico, there was a lack of access to drinking water. So basically, pulque became the beverage par excellence for the whole family. And children drank less, adults drank more. And again, in order for you to get drunk, you need to drink a lot because the percentage of alcohol is not as high, but yes, it has alcohol, it is a fermented beverage. And they saw this as a terrible practice that in a way started kind of like the path of alcoholism among both men and women, but particularly men. And it is also kind of like identified with lack of hygiene, since this woman is basically sharing this drink with her own fingers. So there is no hygiene at all. But the main issue here is that you are giving an alcoholic beverage to a baby, which again, of course, nowadays, I'm sure that for a lot or most of you, it could be like quite shocking, but in the world and the history of food, well, that is not as unusual. In Europe for centuries, like beer was what everybody will drink, because again, that was safer than drinking water that could easily be contaminated. So that's one of the reasons. But again, like for these doctors, that was seen as a sign of uncivilized practices, inferior practices, lack of knowledge, ignorance, and so forth, when they were not necessarily thinking about, well, why are these women giving pulque to their children, and like why this is considered as a sort of like best alternative to go with. So let me move to the next image that I have here. And this is coming from a different book. And I want to put all of these two books together because this one, again, was produced by men, all doctors. And the one that I'm going to show you in a minute was written by a woman, one of the few books. She produced at least 3 books, but those are perhaps one of the examples, or some of the few examples of books produced by women. In this case, Ana Maria Hernandez, she was an educator, she was a teacher, but she was also a member of the Communist Party. And in a way, during her time, she was definitely seen as, of course, a feminist. And this book is very interesting. It is entitled How to Improve the Diet of the Worker and the Peasant. It was published in 1935. It was not given for free. This was a book that she sold. I'm sure that it was not, I'm not completely sure of the cost, but it was not very expensive. And for her, food was also at the core of the transformation of Mexico, and improving the life of the peasantry and the working class went or had to go through improving their diet. And some of these books include a lot of recipes. So they have like advice from like domestic economy and also cottage industry. So how to produce food in your house, how to bake bread, how to cure ham, but also like recipes of like simple meals that were prepared with on a low budget. So definitely those are the things that she incorporates in here, in her documents. And I want to kind of share a quote from her book that definitely tells us a lot about her understandings of what had to be changed in regards to food and nutrition. So she said, "There is nothing better than eating well. You could prepare a splendid meal with little money, both in the countryside and in the city. If you have a pantry stocked with ham, chorizo, and bacon, like the Europeans and North Americans do. Mexicans eat a lot of pork, but as pork rinds, fried pork, or stewed in chili sauce. Ham has never been part of our diet because it is expensive. If our peasants change their diet, we as a nation will have given a step forward. We could feel proud of achieving the transformation of the Mexican people. So here you can see that she is considering that certain kinds of meat, again, even though they may come from pork, are seen as superior than others. So like the way in which Mexicans prepare pork in her mind are not as I don't know if necessarily as nutritious, or they are not as good as ham, bacon, chorizo. And one of the things that she does, as I said, is like teach women how to cure their own ham. But in this advice, you can clearly see that there is a disregard of traditional indigenous diets. And again, of course, there was a lack of information to a certain degree. At other points, she also talks about wild greens that like women, children just gathered, that are extremely nutritious, but they were seen as like, well, that's not something good. What you need to eat is beef. You need to drink milk. You need to have this animal protein of certain quality and prepared in certain ways in order for you to actually improve your health, but also sort of like being seen as jumping into the middle class in a way. So being seen in a different way and acculturate to the mainstream middle class ideas that dominated. But again, they were not the majority of the population. So they were these ideals and of course were endorsed by the professional class, by intellectuals, but they were clearly not the majority. So let me show you these two images and so that we can sort of like wrap up and we can have time to talk about what was interesting to you and to clarify some of your questions or to continue the conversation. Here it says basically clean, like arrange and clean your little kitchen. And here, yeah, we have a difference at least. We have like a women, like a peasant women or a working class women portrayed as like, as they looked, not these sort of like most more westernized ladies. And again, here you have the traditional sort of like kitchen, like what you see where you have like these pots is basically called a brasero. So it was built usually out of rock or concrete or bricks, and in this kind of like space that looks like squares, like holes, that's where you will put the charcoal or the firewood, but most likely the charcoal, and that's how they will cook. So you have like a very basic kitchen, a common kitchen. Again, like it was probably a family that had some means, because otherwise you would just like cook in an open fire at the ground level. So here they had this brasero, they had their pots and pans, they have like their wooden spoons, their utensils, and this idea that you have to be very even though you are poor, you have to keep your house clean and tidy. So that's kind of like the message here. You may not afford one of these like gas stoves that we saw in the first image, but you can keep your house nice and tidy. And this other image that we have here, it says like, kind of like order your work and have your house always clean. And this is particularly interesting, this image, because you have all these elements that are revealing of the changes that Mexican society was experiencing, but also these middle class ideals. So you have this, the tablecloth covering the table. So again, it's this important element of decoration, of it has to look nice. You may not have a lot of money. You may, and probably she was thinking that you can make your own tablecloth, you can engrave your tablecloth, you can decorate it so it looks nice and it's welcoming. You also have this pot of flowers as well to decorate your house. And again, those flowers may be coming from your garden, so you don't necessarily need to spend that much money. You have also in the background sort of like a picture, like it seems like a frame here. Like I don't know how clear it is, but it seems to have like the way in which traditionally indigenous people are portrayed, so like sort of like seated with their sort of like ponchos or sarapes and with their hats, kind of like resting in the countryside. So making reference to the countryside, and in the background you have like an image of a factory, a chimney. So making reference to the workers. But again, the idea that you are going to decorate your household, even though you may not have a lot of money, you will find a way to decorate it and make it more welcoming, but also make it look closer to how middle-class households and homes looked. The other key point, of course, is the watch, the clock there. So the idea that you have to keep track of time, that you have to be very well organized, that even though you are a housewife, you keep track of time and you are working ideally in some of their suggestions where like you have to be able to work 8 hours, even if you're at home, rest 8 hours, and sort of like have 8 hours of leisure. Of course, like most likely these women were working all day, didn't have any leisure, but the idea that, well, if you are well organized, you will have time for yourself and to rest and to be rested when your husband and your children arrive home. And of course, she's sweeping the floor, so she's keeping her house nice and clean. So those are the things that I find very interesting about these images. And again, these women look more like closer to how most Mexicans will look like. They are not necessarily portrayed in these more Europeanized or facial features. So that is definitely something interesting and different to the other book that I mentioned. So these books present the cultural practices of the middle class formed by young professionals, doctors, nurses, and teachers who considered that their way of life had to be emulated by the working class and the peasantry. They emphasized work ethic, discipline, cleanliness, and Western diet instead of local and traditional knowledge. They frequently ignored the material and economic conditions that prevailed in poor neighborhoods and rural areas. For most peasant and working class women, it was difficult or impossible to follow the advice offered in these books. Still, the message was that indigenous peoples and peasants could improve their life through a process of acculturation. They could become mestizos by embracing Western culture and the practices of the global North, while forgetting about their culture and traditions which were seen as inferior. Nutrition played a central role in this process, as these books reveal. And finally, I want to kind of just close with this image that comes from the 1940s as well. And it's an ad that was trying to increase the consumption of milk. And this was a milk certified factory, because they basically bought powder milk that they reconstituted in Mexico to sell it at lower prices. But what I find also very interesting is the image that you have here of course, women. The mother is in charge of like feeding the family, but the family that you have there is clearly not the traditional sort of like Mexican family. They only have 2 children. The father is wearing a tie and a sort of like the attire of white collar workers, or somebody who worked in an office rather than working in a factory. And the women, again, the features that you can see are clearly much more likely to be found in the United States or in some parts of Europe. And this publicity, again, in most cases, these companies were American companies that utilized the same images that they had used in American magazines to basically publicize products in Mexico, which again, I think that there was also a logic behind that, because that's what Mexicans had to aspire to be. That's the sort of like ideal, that's the model that we have to emulate the diet of the United States or some European nations, and therefore we will be able to achieve the material progress that these nations were able to display at that moment in time and enjoy. Okay, so I will stop there, and I will stop sharing my screen so that we can hopefully engage in a conversation here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great and informative talk. And I really appreciate the visuals too. It's interesting to see what discourses are still present with us today and what discourses have changed. We have a significant chunk of time for questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the question and answer section. I know that there is one already up, and Caitlin asks, how have you seen the use of more European-looking advertisements affecting the lives of women in Mexico? Do you think that there's a sense of confusion or identity work going on because of that?
Yes, I think this is a fascinating question. And in a way, what I find more shocking is that most Mexicans are so used to that they see it as normal. So the fact that the women that appear in magazines, the women and men that appear in TV are nothing like them. So like blonde girls and blonde boys and these like women with like light skin, green eyes, and that's something that is so common that when you see a TV production or a magazine where that is not the case, it's like, that is the strange part. That is kind of like what is surprising to me, that they don't see it as an issue. It's like, we are so used to this. It's like, of course, so if you want to go and appear in TV, you have to have light skin. Otherwise, you won't be able to become an actor or an actress. Or if you are, then you have always the role of the servant, the thief, the beggar, the drug addict. So like, and again, in a way, it's not as different in Hollywood to a certain degree. So it has been changing. And definitely, if you think about TV in this country, like the Latino networks, they are far more inclusive, I think, that at least networks in Mexico, but still there's a long way to go. And of course, I definitely think that there has been this sense of like, well, who we are and the extent to which we think that yes, of course, like these women or these men appear there because they are beautiful or they are handsome, and like somebody with dark skin cannot be beautiful, cannot be handsome. So I definitely think that is in their minds. Again, it is changing slowly, and still there is a long fight in that regard. But yes, I find that fact of misrepresentation or lack of representation in the media in Latin America in general, but particularly in Mexico, is something that requires a lot of work. But the first element is the first step is to realize that there's an issue, that's not right, that's not how I look, that's not how my children look. So no, but that's the first step that I think it's little by little changing there. So let me go through some of the questions that we have here. Let me see, were the Hispanic people aware of this, I guess, interest, white superiority show to them? So the way in which, I guess, like, were they aware of that? Well, I definitely think, again, I think that they are aware to a certain extent, but it's not constructed like that. So if you think about Latin America, more than 500 years of colonization, and since the very beginning, like starting to receive all these discourse or breathe and eat and learn and observe these ideas that, well, people with light skin are wealthier, are more intelligent, are better, have more opportunities, that it's really introjected in a way. So to the extent that you cannot actually see that that's not true, that's not the case. And of course, you have the element of social class and economics that is basically reproducing this. So if you don't have enough money to go to high school, then like chances are that you won't be able to have more opportunities or improve your economic situation in life, unless you sort of like go into perhaps join a drug cartel, and then yes, of course, you will make a lot of money, but who knows for how long, and if you will be able to survive more than a year. But it's really hard. So which are the opportunities that they have to actually improve in life, to have a better future? In a way, that's one of the reasons why also like Mexicans end up coming to the United States. So that's another reason in a way. So it's really interesting and complex in a way. So let me think here. Do you think that the government of Mexico is starting to do a better job of representing indigenous people in the country today? Well, I think that they are improving, at least, well, now that we have a different president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. he definitely has a very different rhetoric. He has a very different discourse. I'm not completely sure to what extent that will bring radical change, or at least some change. But yes, he has been, or he wants to be seen at least as somebody who represents the majority, basically represents the poor, represents those people who don't have access to economic means, to have been sort of like left out or left behind by previous governments. And of course, within these groups are the indigenous peoples, but it's always a challenge. In a way, I think that dilemma of to what extent you respect and recognize indigenous culture and see it as valuable versus no, they have to change. They have to stop being who they are, or well, they can continue to speak their own language, but they have to learn Spanish and they have to be part of the capitalist economy. And that could go completely, let's say, against their own traditions and way of life, and therefore it's very problematic to sort of like ask them to do things at the same time in a way. So I definitely think that it's not as easy. So his discourse, as I said, seems to be more inclusive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that indigenous people feel that is actually being inclusive. And again, when we talk about indigenous people, like in any part of the world, but particularly, of course, in Mexico and the same in the US, they are not all the same. So you have all these different groups from the like south, like if you think about the state of Yucatan, the Mayas, those who are in Chiapas, those who are in Oaxaca, those who are more towards the central part of Mexico, they are different and their needs are also different. So it's kind of like complicated in a way to just put them all into the category of indigenous people and they all agree or disagree with certain things.
Just to follow up on that, there are two questions that seem like follow-up questions for that, both about indigenous groups in Mexico. One asked about how do you feel about indigenous people being labeled as indios or indias, and if that is adding to colorism in Latin America. And the other one asked if these kind of perceptions or viewpoints of indigenous people are changing or can change, and how that might be.
Yes, so yeah, I think definitely Latin America is like the term Indio, and particularly in Mexico, tends to be pejorative. So particularly, I will say in our times, contemporary times, but probably it always was used in a certain way as a pejorative term. So you frequently it is utilized as an insult to say that somebody's an Indio or an Indian. The term indigena, which is probably the equal to, or what you will say in English, indigenous or indigenous people, is perhaps seen as more respectful, not necessarily seeing them as less or inferior to you. So in that sense, yes, you have these different ways of referring to these groups. And also the idea of who are, I think, indigenous peoples, it's very complex. So in the US, it's very much connected to like, where do you live? Who are your parents? This idea of like, you have to prove that your ancestry belongs to this particular group, or you have to live in a reservation. So in Mexico, it's very fluid. So it's basically, to a certain extent, up to you if you want to say, I am an indigenous person. Frequently, of course, it is a term that you don't even kind of like use to describe yourself. So it's like you may say I am Tzotzil because I am belonging to this indigenous group, but it's not as common for them to utilize this. I think in more recent times where there has been a discourse about rights to land, rights to sort of like maintain your cultural practices, now it is kind of like used. So when it has when it can have some sort of like outcome to utilize the term I am an indigenous person and you can get something out of it, then yes, you can embrace the term. If it's just used as an insult, of course you are not going to say, yes, I am an Indian. So definitely it's interesting to see how this term has changed and how recently it has been changing even more. But yes, in a way, traditionally, those are groups that we identify with the countryside, that we see as well. They speak another language, they speak a native language, and they eat different food. In general, most of them do not have money. But once a person that comes from that community, let's say acculturate or assimilate and learn Spanish and now only speaks Spanish and moves to the city, and now it's like completely urban, changes the way she or he dresses, the way she or he speaks, then he will not identify himself as a member of that indigenous community at all. So it's also interesting to see how that is fluid, and in a way it's also an issue of how you want to identify yourself. But yes, in recent times there has also been a movement within culture, within like of writers, poets, musicians who are of indigenous background and who embrace their indigenous identity and say, yes, I am an indigenous person, and I like write poetry in 2 languages, and I sing songs in 2 languages. And you have, of course, like, as you can imagine, kind of like a whole movement of rock, hip hop, and in native languages. So that is kind of like something that is changing, that they are embracing their culture, and instead of saying, I'm not going to speak publicly in my own native tongue because they are going to see me as, you are an Indian. I am sort of like proud of my indigenous identity and I embrace it. But it's something that in a way it's starting to change, and that for sure it's something positive. So
There
let me
was
see.
changing topics slightly.
Yeah.
There's one about childcare. Is childcare still seen as the mother's job in Mexico? And do ads about childcare still target women?
Yes, for sure. So it's again changing a little bit. So there is, of course, a discussion about, well, or the government trying to create ads to engage fathers in raising children, in helping at home, in doing house chores. So yes, that is changing, but yes, traditionally women have been the ones in charge of looking after children. If not, and again, if you have like at this time period, big families, most likely the mother was like so busy cooking or like looking after the babies that you have like the older sisters basically in charge of the younger siblings. So women, but again, always these women being in charge. Or if you have like these households where you have like an extended family, you had the grandmothers or the grandparents like looking after the children. But I definitely think that still nowadays, that's kind of like the expectation. Of course, in urban areas, the same as it happens here in the US, both parents are working. So it's not easy. You have to rely on somebody looking after your children, somebody from your family. If you don't have that much money, or if possible, you go to some sort of like daycare. There are like public daycares that like do not cost women anything, but you have to be working in certain kinds of like institutions to be able to have access to that sort of like public daycare as a benefit in a way. So the majority of the women don't have access to that. So yes, that is still a challenge. And of course, men now are more involved than they were in the 1930s, but I definitely think that still their responsibility relies mainly on women, and they have like the same as here, no? And it's not as different in a way. So most women are in charge of children, in charge of their household, and yes, like some men may help more than others, but it's still seen like that. And at this moment in time, what is really interesting is that the father was seen as completely absent. So the father can, like, we are not expecting to educate the father in terms of like what the children eat, because like, no, that's not their realm. And they are seen, if in a more positive light, they are seen as the breadwinners who are always working or work most of the day. So they arrive at home and you have to keep them happy. You have to serve them a good meal. You have to be like refreshed and happy and smiling. Don't receive your husband with all the complaints about the terrible things that the children have done. So you have to make him feel comfortable at home. So that was basically the idea. Otherwise, he will abandon you and find some other place to be. So that's kind of like the sort of advice that you receive at that period. Nowadays, well, most likely it's very frequent that both men and women work. So it's a different dynamic for sure.
I have a student from my class, the Food, Culture, and Society class, and we read your article about nutrition and milk and maternity in Mexico. And so Kennedy asked, is milk still widely available and consumed in Mexico today, in similar with an eye towards how consumption goes in the US?
Yes, I think that it's available. Definitely, it's very much available in the same way that it is here in the United States. But there are some key features that I definitely would like to make as a difference. So most of the milk that is consumed in Mexico come in these packages that I am trying to remember how you call them. Like the only brand that you have here in the US that is like that is Parmalat.
These are like plastic envelopes.
Well,
right?
plastic envelope, but it's kind of like that. It's called a Tetra Pak, but it's like the one that you use in camping.
The ultra high
Exactly.
pasteurized, so they don't need to be refrigerated. Yep.
That is the most common milk that most Mexicans drink. So that's the common kind of like milk means that. And it tastes very different. And that's, of course, now that I have children, now that we go to Mexico, they don't like milk in Mexico because it tastes so different that they prefer not to drink it. And yes, like now that I am here and I am used to drinking milk, it is different. I'm not completely sure exactly why, but it tastes very different. But it's also very common. So like milk for sure now has been incorporated into the diet of most Mexicans. But another key feature as well is that you have a huge variety of milks. I don't know why they have like these brands for like people 40 and above, for teenagers, for children, for babies, for the seniors, but also they have a much more wider options in terms of the lactose intolerance products. And that's something that in a way it's connected to the article that you read, and I'm glad that you read it and that you liked it, of the intolerance to lactose that we have in Mexico, and that is very common among communities who have indigenous ancestry, because again, indigenous people do not have that sort of like gene that allow them to digest cow's milk, because they did not like develop that in their history. So there were no cows in the Americas, and milk was not part of their diet as in many other parts of the world as well. So that is something that is different to the United States. So here, yes, you have like Lacta8, you have like some, I think one brand that produces like milk and yogurt, but in Mexico you have a wider variety of options, from cheese to milk to cream to yogurt, that is for those who are lactose intolerant.
Thanks. I think the next question is about traditional values and practices and maybe foodways for indigenous peoples today, if there's been a significant change or they're still being practiced. Or maybe
there has been
both.
a significant change. So yes, there has been a significant change, and it's really interesting. I remember that for my research, another source that I used, and that's something that you also could see in the article of milk, was rely on oral histories. And I found that extremely fascinating and interesting. And the fact that I was studying the 1930s, 40s, 50s allowed me to still talk with women who were alive at that moment in time, and like that were alive when I conducted those interviews 10, 15 years ago. So yes, some of these women were like in shock to say, well, I used to like have just like cornmeal for breakfast and perhaps beans and tortillas, and now my children have sausages and Coke. So that's what they eat now, like Coke as a salt, like instead of atole, which is this corn gruel, or some sort of like a beverage prepared with corn, and like processed food, sausages, which is probably, at least the ones that they sell in Mexico, they are probably the worst, like all the leftovers from the pork, so not necessarily high quality meat at all. So fat, salt, so that's it basically. So yeah, she was kind of like very sad to see that was what happened to her children. But when she was a child, she lived in the outskirts of Mexico City, in a very rural area as well. So they were like subsistence peasants, and now, well, they are part of the urban proletariat. So they are kind of like living in these poor neighborhoods in the outskirts that are urbanized, that don't have access to land, so they cannot grow anything to feed their families. And that has been in a way the experience of a lot of peasants who have migrated both within Mexico and to the United States. And in the case of the United States, it's also very interesting what you see among communities of migrants who come from the countryside, when like you go from this perception of like, I couldn't afford to buy like some potato chips to my children, or cookies, or any kind of processed food, because like we didn't have money. We were just like eating what we grew, like corn, beans. Again, that could be seen as a very healthy diet, but for some of these people, that means poverty. So that sort of like diet is identified with poverty. So now that we can earn money, that we live in a place where we have access to much more in terms of food, but again, mainly processed food, of course, that's what we now eat. And yes, that's great. If we can go to McDonald's every day, or if we can like buy cookies and chips to our kids, and they can now eat that, something that we were not able to do because we didn't have money, we didn't have access to those goods, that is seen as like we made it in a way. So I definitely think that is frequently seen as kind of like the American dream. Like now we can eat in McDonald's every day, which is of course not very healthy. And again, like some people may like it, and that's fine, but clearly not something that you are going to have on a daily basis, and not something that you can compare in terms of nutritional value with corn, beans, and chili, and tortillas, and kind of like some protein, but not as much beef that perhaps you can have in the diet here in the US, but the same in the city. So for instance, something that is very common to find in the streets in Mexico City, but other cities as well, is these sort of like noodles, instant noodle soups that are not necessarily very nutritious. They fill you, I guess, they fill your stomach, but that's what they will eat. No? But now I can buy that instead of just like having tortilla with beans that is seen like, no, that's for poor people. Now we can afford to buy these like instant noodle soup in the street, and then like now we have the money. But of course, it has also generated a lot of problems in terms of obesity, in terms of diabetes, in terms of heart disease. Again, not very similar, not very different to what is happening in the United States. So yes, poverty, it's now particularly in urban areas identified with these changes in diet that end up being for worse rather than for good.
There was one, just following up on that, there's one question about the kind of tie between physically overweight and obesity, and how that's viewed in Mexico.
Well, I definitely think that it's not very different to what you see here in the United States. So definitely there is this sense that obesity is not something good. Again, the idea of overweight, that is a little bit more fluid in a way, to what extent you are seen more as a strong. So traditionally in the past, there was this idea that the like a chubby baby was a healthy baby. So you want that rather than like a skinny baby. So there is this sense that you have to be more on the chubby side rather than skin. That means that there's something wrong with you. You are perhaps you're ill, and what's wrong with you. So definitely that is something that you still observe. But well, then when the line, which is the line between being overweight and being obese, so that I think is sometimes not as clear. So I definitely think that when you start to have health issues, then it becomes more of a problem. So when you are a child and you have diabetes, or you cannot run, or you sort of like start to develop health, heart disease, and so forth, then it of course becomes more of an issue. But it's very common. So like Mexico is one of the countries with the highest percentage of obesity. It has the highest consumption of soda, so more than in the United States. Again, now they are not drinking pulque, they are drinking Coke, which I don't necessarily think it's healthier than pulque. But those are the changes that you have observed. It's like, well, we have not access to drinking water. What are we going to do? Or sometimes drinking water is more expensive if you buy it. You cannot drink out of the tap because it's not, chances are that you are going to get ill. or there's no like tap water in your house. You don't have like access to potable drinking water at home. So you have to buy water, and that could be very expensive. So if you buy a Coke, you like have the calories of the sugar. So you feel that there's something in your stomach, and then like you know that you're not going to get ill as a result of drinking water that may be contaminated. So, but yes, I think that definitely that's something that is changing in Mexico, since the obesity rates are increasing dramatically.
I just want to be mindful of the fact that Dr. Aguilar-Rodríguez is joining us from the East Coast, where it's an hour later. And so I think maybe we have time for one more question. Megan, do you have a good candidate in there?
Yeah, I have one final question about what other gender roles outside of the homemaker breadwinner structure are present in Mexican culture today? How have gender roles changed since the 1930s?
Yes, I definitely think that they have changed. Again, now you can be a woman and be the main or the sole breadwinner. And again, at that moment in time, it also happened, but it was not seen as the right thing or the proper thing to be experiencing. So you were not necessarily going to be proud of that. And nowadays, I think it's much more common to have women who are the primary breadwinners, or women within households who earn more money than their husbands, or have at least more stable jobs that offer more benefits to their families rather than the husband. And again, another important thing also to acknowledge is the increased openness to sexual diversity. The fact that in Mexico City now you can like marry, like marriage is something that is available to everybody, like to men, to women. It doesn't have to be just a man and a woman who get married. They can adopt children. Like in Mexico City also relatively recently, abortion was made legal. You can go to a public health hospital and request it, so you have to pay for it. It's available for every woman without any further investigation. So those are things that for sure have allowed women to modify their life and to have some increase their agency to say, well, I don't want to have more children, or I was too young, I didn't want to have these children, and or I want to marry another woman, or two men who want to marry, who want to adopt. So that's definitely changing the gender roles. Again, it's not to say that the whole country is the same. So there are some states within Mexico, the same as in the United States, of course, that are very conservative, in which abortion is banned, in which there is no same-sex marriage. So for sure, that is something that is there. So it's not across the board in Mexico, but at least in Mexico City and most urban areas, it is changing, and you start to see more of an acceptance to different sort of like ways of being men, of being women, without necessarily be seen as kind of like abnormal and being sort of like ostracized. But of course, like there is still a long way to go, but I definitely think that it's changing for sure.
Thank you so much on behalf of the Latino Latin American Studies program and our muted viewing audience. I'd like to express very warm thank you for sharing your work with us tonight. This is a fantastic way to get our series started. I have so many questions myself, but I'll shoot you an email with those. Thank you, Megan, for introducing and managing the Q&A.
One question that came up in the Q&A is there are already people who are inquiring about the recording. So if that can be made public, or how you'll make that public afterwards.
Thank you for raising that. Yeah, we are recording this session, and obviously with Dr. Aguilar-Rodríguez's permission, we will make that available once it's processed and whatnot. So yes, that will be available. I should also mention that I hope that everyone who is here this evening will join us again on October 14th. Our next speaker will be our colleague, Dr. Pedro dos Santos, who will be talking about women's empowerment and disempowerment in Brazil. So that should be a fascinating conversation. October 14th, Wednesday, same time, Central Time, 7 p.m.